The desert stretched endlessly under a sky the color of rust. Twin suns hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes of Seven. It was a dead world, or so the colonial surveys claimed. No native life, no water, no strategic value, just sand, rock, and silence that could drive a man mad if he listened to it long enough. Danny Cole had been listening to it for 6 months. He sat in the cockpit of his rover, watching the wind carry spirals of dust across the plain. His job was simple enough: map the terrain, collect mineral samples, file reports to a colonial office that probably deleted them without reading. It was lonely work, the kind they gave to people who did not complain and did not ask questions. Danny was good at both. He was 32 years old, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that spoke of years spent on frontier worlds. He had no family waiting for him back on Earth, no sweetheart sending messages through the relay stations. Just Hopper, the outdated AI unit built into his rover, whose voice sounded like a bored librarian reading from a manual. Atmospheric sensors indicate an incoming weather event, Hopper announced. Estimated arrival in 47 minutes. Recommend seeking shelter. Danny looked at the horizon. A wall of brown was building in the distance, swallowing the light as it approached. Sandstorms on Seven were not gentle. They could strip the paint off a ship and bury a man in minutes. He started the rover and drove toward a rocky outcrop he had mapped 2 weeks earlier. The formation jutted from the sand like the bones of some ancient creature, creating a natural shelter against the wind. He parked the rover in its shadow and shut down the engines. The storm hit an hour later. It roared against the rocks with a sound like 1,000 angry voices. Sand pelted the rover's hull in waves, and the world outside disappeared into a churning brown void. Danny sat in the darkness, listening to the fury of the planet, and waited. He must have fallen asleep at some point. When he opened his eyes, the storm had passed. The suns were rising again, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The desert looked different now, reshaped by the wind into new patterns and new dunes. Danny stepped out of the rover and stretched his aching back. The air was still and hot, carrying the faint smell of minerals and dust. He walked around the outcrop to check for damage and found none. The rover was built to survive worse. He was about to head back inside when something caught his eye. A glint of silver, half buried in a newly formed dune about 50 meters away. Danny frowned. There should be nothing metallic out here. The surveys had found no signs of previous visitors, no crashed ships, no abandoned equipment. He had mapped this area himself and found nothing but rock and sand. Curiosity pulled him forward. He climbed the dune, his boots sinking into the loose sand with every step. The glint grew brighter as he approached, and he realized it was not metal. It was something else. Something that reflected light in a way he had never seen before. He reached the top of the dune and looked down. His heart stopped. It was a body. An alien body, half buried in the sand. The figure was humanoid in shape but clearly not human. The skin was a pale lavender color, smooth and delicate like porcelain. The features were elegant, almost ethereal, with high cheekbones and a slender nose. Pointed ears emerged from beneath strands of silver hair that spread across the sand like threads of moonlight. Delicate ridges traced along the temples, and intricate silver markings ran down the neck and disappeared beneath the torn fabric of what might have been clothing. It was a female. Danny could tell that much from the shape of the body, though everything else about her was foreign to him. Her eyes were closed and her lips were slightly parted. She looked peaceful, like she was sleeping. But she was cold, so cold that Danny could feel it even before he touched her. He knelt beside her and brushed the sand away from her face. Her skin felt like ice beneath his fingers. There was no breath, no movement, no sign of life. She was dead. She had to be dead. No one could survive being buried in the desert like this. Danny reached for his scanner and ran it over her body. The device hummed softly as it analyzed her biosigns. For a long moment the screen showed nothing, just flat lines and empty readings. Then a flicker appeared. A single, faint pulse, so weak it barely registered on the display. Danny stared at the screen. He ran the scan again, adjusting the sensitivity. The pulse appeared once more, accompanied by a tiny spike in cellular activity. It was not death. It was something close to it, something between life and the void, but it was not death. She was dying slowly, painfully, but she was not dead yet. Danny looked at her face. He did not know who she was. He did not know where she came from or how she ended up buried in the sands of this forgotten world. He did not know if saving her was possible or even wise. But he knew he could not leave her here. He slid his arms beneath her body and lifted her from the sand. She weighed almost nothing, as if her bones were hollow like a bird. Her head fell against his shoulder, and her silver hair brushed against his cheek. Up close, he could see the damage more clearly. Her skin was cracked in places, dehydrated and brittle. Her breathing was so shallow it was nearly invisible. Danny carried her down the dune, stumbling twice in the loose sand but never letting her fall. He reached the rover and managed to open the rear hatch with his elbow. The interior was cramped and cluttered with equipment, but there was a cot in the corner where he slept during long survey runs. He laid her down gently and pulled a thermal blanket over her body. Hopper's voice broke the silence. Bioscan indicates an unknown species. Vital signs are critical. Recommend contacting the nearest colonial outpost for medical assistance. Danny looked at the communication panel. The nearest outpost was 3 hours away by signal relay. Even if they responded immediately, it would take another 6 hours for any ship to reach 7. That was 9 hours minimum. She did not have 9 hours. Danny turned back to the alien woman on the cot. Her chest rose and fell in tiny, desperate movements. Her golden eyelids flickered but did not open. He did not know how to save her. He was not a doctor. He was just a survey technician with basic first aid training and a stubborn refusal to accept the obvious. But he was going to try anyway. He sat down beside the cot and began to work. The night was long and filled with fear. Danny worked by the pale light of the rover's emergency lamps, his hands moving with a focus he did not know he possessed. The alien woman lay motionless on the cot, her body cold and still, her breathing so faint it seemed ready to stop at any moment. He connected her to the rover's medical system, a basic unit designed for human emergencies. The readings it gave were confusing and incomplete. Her biology was different from anything the system recognized. Her blood chemistry was wrong. Her cellular structure was wrong. Everything about her was a mystery the machine could not solve. But Danny did not need the machine to tell him she was dying. He started with what he knew. Dehydration was killing her. He could see it in the cracks on her skin and the sunken hollows of her cheeks. He prepared an IV line from his emergency kit and searched for a vein in her arm. Her veins were thin and purple, barely visible beneath her lavender skin. It took him 3 tries before he found one that would hold. The fluid began to drip into her body, slow and steady. Danny watched the monitor, hopping for some sign of improvement. The readings flickered but did not change. He adjusted the rover's atmospheric controls next. The air on 7 was thin and dry, suitable for humans but possibly harmful to her. He increased the oxygen content and added moisture to the circulation system. The temperature inside the rover rose slightly, creating a warm and humid environment that felt uncomfortable to him but might help her. Hours passed. Danny did not sleep. He sat beside the cot and watched her face, looking for any sign of life. He talked to her, not knowing if she could hear him, not caring if she could not. He told her about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests he had not seen in years. He told her about his childhood in a small town in Montana, about fishing in cold rivers and watching the stars from his father's porch. He told her she was going to be okay. that she was not alone anymore, that he would not let her die in this empty place. Her biosigns remained weak. The monitor showed a heartbeat so slow it barely counted as one. Her temperature was rising slightly, but her organs were still failing. The medical system estimated her chances of survival at less than 12%. Danny ignored the number. He remembered something from his training, a technique used for hypothermia victims. The human body could survive extreme cold if warmed slowly from the core. He did not know if her body worked the same way, but he had no other ideas. He wrapped thermal packs around her torso and placed heating elements near her major arteries. He covered her with every blanket he had and sealed the cot inside a thermal cocoon. The temperature inside the cocoon rose steadily, and Danny watched the monitor with desperate hope. Around midnight, something changed. Her heartbeat grew stronger, not by much, but enough for the monitor to notice. The rhythm stabilized, shifting from erratic flutters to something resembling a steady pulse. Her breathing deepened, and color began to return to her cheeks. Danny let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He kept working through the night, adjusting the fluids and temperature as her body responded. By the time the twin suns rose again, her vital signs had improved dramatically. She was still weak, still damaged, but she was no longer dying. She was fighting. Danny leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Exhaustion washed over him like a wave, dragging him toward sleep. He fought it for as long as he could, but his body had reached its limit. He drifted off with his hand resting on the edge of the cot, close enough to feel if she moved. He woke to the sound of breathing. Not his own, hers. Danny opened his eyes and found her staring at him. Her eyes were open, wide and golden like twin suns. They were the most beautiful and frightening eyes he had ever seen, filled with confusion and fear, and something else he could not name. She was looking at him as if he were some strange creature she had never encountered before, which, he supposed, he was. She tried to speak. Her lips moved, forming sounds that were not words, at least not words he understood. Her voice was weak and cracked, damaged by dehydration and disuse. She reached toward him with a trembling hand, then stopped, uncertain. Danny did not move. He kept his body still and his expression calm, the way he would approach a frightened animal. He did not want to scare her. "It is okay," he said softly. "You are safe now. I am not going to hurt you." She did not understand his words. He could see that in her eyes, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. Her hand lowered and her breathing slowed. The fear in her eyes faded slightly, replaced by exhaustion. Danny pointed to himself. "Danny," he said, "my name is Danny." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she pointed to herself with a shaking finger. And she whispered. It was a name, her name, the first word they shared. Danny smiled. "That is a beautiful name." She did not understand, but she seemed to recognize the kindness in his voice. Her golden eyes softened, and the tension in her body eased. She was still afraid, still confused, but she was beginning to trust him. She tried to sit up and immediately fell back, too weak to support her own weight. Danny moved forward and caught her shoulders, steadying her against the pillow. "Easy," he said. "You have been through a lot, you need to rest." Looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She reached up and touched his cheek with her fingertips. Her touch was cold but gentle, almost reverent. She said something in her language, a string of soft syllables that sounded like music. Danny did not know what she said, but he felt its meaning somehow. Gratitude, disbelief, a question that had no words. "Why did you save me?" He took her hand and held it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "Because I could," he said simply. "Because no one deserves to die alone in the sand." Closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her lavender cheek, leaving a silver trail in its wake. She did not speak again. She did not need to. For the first time since her world had ended, she was not alone. Danny stayed beside her as she drifted back into sleep. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the peaceful expression on her face. She was alive. Against all odds, against every prediction of the medical system, she was alive. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know where she came from or what had brought her to this barren world. He did not know if helping her would bring trouble to his doorstep or change the course of his life forever. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had saved a life, that was enough. The days that followed were strange and wonderful. Danny had never spent time with an alien before. He had seen them in passing at spaceports and trading stations, distant figures with strange faces and stranger customs. But he had never sat with one, shared meals with one, or watched one learn to speak his language word by careful word. Was a remarkable student. She absorbed new vocabulary like a sponge absorbing water, her golden eyes lighting up with understanding whenever she grasped a new concept. Danny started with simple things: food, water, sleep, hot, cold, yes, no. Within a week she could form basic sentences. Within 2 weeks she could hold a conversation. Her recovery was equally impressive. The color had returned to her skin, a healthy lavender that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the rover. The cracks had healed, leaving her complexion smooth and unblemished. She could walk now, though she tired easily, and she spent hours sitting at the rover's viewport, staring at the endless desert with an expression Danny could not read. He learned many things about her during those quiet days. Her people were called the. They came from a world far from human space, a green and gentle planet where violence was considered the greatest sin. They had evolved as healers, their biology naturally attuned to repairing damage and curing disease. Their touch could mend wounds. Their minds could sense pain and illness in others. They were pacifists by nature and by choice, believing that all life was sacred and that conflict served no purpose. This philosophy had made them targets. Told Danny about the one evening as they sat together watching the sun set. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled in her lap as she spoke. They were a warrior species, brutal and efficient, who had built their empire on conquest and slavery. They did not want territory or resources. They wanted themselves. A healer was worth more than gold on the black markets of the galaxy. Their abilities could save the lives of warlords and criminals, could extend the of tyrants and monsters. They had invaded space not to destroy, but to harvest. They captured healers by the thousands and sold them to the highest bidders across 100 systems. Had been captured during a raid on her village. She was young by standards, barely past childhood, but her healing abilities were strong. They had taken her and placed her on a transport bound for the slave markets of the Outer Rim, but had refused to cooperate. When they ordered her to heal a wounded officer, she had refused. When they threatened her with pain and death, she had still refused. She would not use her gift to serve monsters. She would rather die than become a tool of suffering. They did not kill her. Death was too quick, too merciful. Instead, they declared her defective and sentenced her to abandonment. They flew to a barren world, a planet with no water and no life, and they threw her into the sand like garbage. They left her there to die slowly, painfully, as a message to any other who might consider defiance. That barren world was 7. Danny listened to her story in silence. His jaw tightened with every word, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had seen cruelty before. He had witnessed the darker sides of humanity on a dozen frontier worlds. But this was something different. This was evil on a scale he could barely comprehend. When finished, she looked at him with those golden eyes and asked a question that he would never forget. "Your people," she said quietly, "the humans, what do they do when someone attacks the defenseless?" Danny thought about the question for a long moment. He thought about human history, about all the wars and conflicts and atrocities that had marked their species. He thought about the capacity for cruelty that lived in every human heart. But he also thought about something else. He thought about the firefighters who ran into burning buildings, the soldiers who threw themselves on grenades to save their friends, the ordinary people who stood up against injustice even when it cost them everything. He looked at and answered honestly, "We do not take it well." She tilted her head, confused by the phrase. "What does that mean?" Danny smiled, but there was no humor in it. "It means we fight. When someone hurts the innocent, when someone preys on those who cannot defend themselves, humans fight. Not always, not perfectly. We have made many mistakes throughout our history, but at our best, when we see true evil, we do not look away. We stand up. We push back. We make sure the monsters know that their actions have consequences." Was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then she asked another question, one that cut deeper than she knew. "Would you fight for the—" Danny met her eyes. He saw the hope there, fragile and uncertain, and he saw the fear. She was asking if humans would care about a species they had never met, a people from the far side of the galaxy who had nothing to offer in return. She was asking if compassion extended beyond the boundaries of tribe and nation and species. He did not answer immediately. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise her that humanity would rise up and destroy thee and free every slave in the galaxy. But he knew the truth was more complicated. Colonial authorities would not intervene in a conflict that did not affect human interests. Politicians would weigh the costs and benefits and decide it was not worth the risk. The galaxy was vast, and most people were too busy with their own problems to care about the suffering of strangers. But Danny also knew something else. He knew that rules and authorities and politics did not always have the final word. He knew that there were people out there, scattered across human space, who still believed in right and wrong. People who would fight for justice even when it was inconvenient. People who refused to accept that some evils were too big to challenge. He looked at and made a decision. "I cannot speak for all of humanity," he said slowly, "but I can speak for myself, and I will do everything in my power to help your people." Stared at him. Her eyes glistened with tears she was too proud to shed. "Why," she whispered, "you do not know us, you have no reason to care." Danny reached out and took her hand. It was warm now, full of life, a far cry from the cold and lifeless thing he had pulled from the sand. "I do not need a reason," he said. "Some things are just worth doing." Did not respond. She simply held his hand and watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to feel something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. Danny filed his report the next morning. He sat at the rover's communication terminal and typed out everything had told him. The invasion, the slave trade, the systematic destruction of an entire peaceful civilization. He included coordinates, timelines, and every detail he could verify. He marked it as urgent and sent it to the colonial authorities' main office on station. The response came 3 days later. It was a form letter, polite and bureaucratic, thanking him for his report and informing him that the matter had been reviewed by the appropriate departments. Unfortunately, the letter explained, they were not allied with human space. They operated in a sector far beyond colonial jurisdiction. Any intervention would require significant resources and political capital that simply could not be justified given current priorities. The colonial authority appreciated his concern, but could not take action at this time. Danny read the letter twice, then he deleted it. He sat alone in the rover for a long time, staring at the blank screen. Was outside, walking among the dunes, rebuilding her strength one step at a time. She did not know about the report. She did not know that Danny had tried to summon help and been refused. He had not told her yet. He was not sure how to tell her that the official answer was no. But Danny had never been good at accepting no. He thought about his life before 7. He had spent 15 years on the frontier, moving from world to world, taking jobs that nobody else wanted. He had met hundreds of people during those years, miners and traders, pilots and mechanics, soldiers who had left the military and wanderers who had never found a home. They were not famous or powerful. They did not have seats in the colonial government or command fleets of warships, but they were good people, most of them. People who still believed in something beyond profit and politics. Danny pulled up his contact list and began to write. He sent messages to everyone he knew, old friends from the mining colonies, former colleagues from the Survey Corps, a pilot named Lucy who ran cargo through the outer systems, a mechanic named Greg who could fix anything with an engine, a retired sergeant named Victor who had once told Danny that the only thing he regretted was all the times he had followed orders instead of his conscience. The messages were simple. Danny explained the situation in plain terms. He told them about He told them about the slave trade. He told them that the colonial authority had refused to help, and he asked a single question. Are you willing to do something about it? The responses began arriving within hours. Lucy was the first. She wrote back a single sentence, "Tell me where to go." Greg followed shortly after, "I have a ship that needs a purpose. Count me in." Victor sent a longer message. He talked about all the years he had spent following orders that felt wrong, all the times he had looked the other way when he should have acted. He was too old for this kind of thing, he said. His back hurt and his reflexes were not what they used to be, but he would rather die trying to do something right than live another year doing nothing. More responses came. Miners who were tired of watching corporations exploit the weak, traders who had seen the slave markets firsthand and been haunted by the memory, former soldiers who had lost faith in the systems they once served, ordinary people who had simply decided that some things mattered more than safety. Within 2 weeks, a small fleet gathered at 17 ships in total. They were not military vessels. They were freighters and cargo haulers, mining rigs and personal shuttles. Some were held together with patches and prayers. None of them were designed for combat. But their pilots were something else entirely. Watch them arrive from the viewport of Danny's rover. Her eyes were wide with disbelief as ship after ship descended from the sky and landed on the desert floor. She turned to Danny with a question in her golden eyes. "Who are these people?" Danny stood beside her and watched the ships unload. Men and women emerged from the hatches, stretching their legs and squinting at the twin suns. They were not soldiers. They were not heroes. They were just people who had decided that they could not stand by and do nothing. "They are humans," Danny said. "They came to help." Shook her head slowly. "But they do not know us. They have nothing to gain. Why would they risk their lives for strangers?" Danny smiled. It was a question he had asked himself many times over the past 2 weeks. The answer was complicated. It involved ideas about duty and honor, and the stubborn belief that right and wrong still meant something in a universe full of darkness. But there was a simpler answer too. "Because someone asked them to," he said, "and they said yes." That evening, Danny gathered everyone together in the shadow of the rocky outcrop. 38 volunteers stood in a loose circle, their faces illuminated by portable lights. They were young and old, men and women, veterans and civilians. They came from a dozen different worlds and had lived 100 different lives, but in that moment they were united by a single purpose. Danny introduced to the group. She stood before them nervously, her silver hair catching the light, her golden eyes reflecting the faces of these strange beings who had come to help her people. She told her story again, the same story she had told Danny. The invasion, the capture, the abandonment, the thousands of still held in chains across the galaxy. Her voice trembled at times, but she did not stop. She spoke until there was nothing left to say. When she finished, there was silence. The volunteers looked at each other, processing what they had heard. Then Victor stepped forward. The old sergeant had gray in his beard and scars on his hands, but his eyes burned with a fire that age could not extinguish. "I have spent my whole life being told what battles are worth fighting," he said. "Bureaucrats and politicians deciding who deserves help and who does not. I am done with that. This is worth fighting for. These people are worth fighting for, and if anyone here disagrees, they can get back in their ship and go home." Nobody moved. Victor nodded slowly and turned to Danny. "All right, kid, you got us here. What is the plan?" Danny looked at the faces around him. Miners and traders, pilots and mechanics, ordinary people who had chosen to become something more. He took a deep breath and began to explain. The plan was simple because it had to be. They did not have the resources for anything complicated. 17 ships, 38 volunteers, no military training, no heavy weapons, no backup coming if things went wrong. But they had something they did not expect. They had surprise. Provided the intelligence. Her telepathic abilities allowed her to sense the presence of other across vast distances, like a candle flickering in the darkness. She could feel them calling out in pain and despair, trapped in holding facilities scattered across space. She identified 3 major transport routes used to move slaves between systems. She pinpointed the location of a processing station on the edge of the sector, where captured were sorted and sold. That station became their target. The journey took 8 days. The fleet traveled in silence, running dark through the void between stars. They avoided shipping lanes and patrol routes, slipping through the cracks in territory like ghosts. Danny piloted one of the lead ships, a converted cargo hauler that Lucy had retrofitted with better engines and basic shields. Sat beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the stars ahead. She had not wanted to come. She was still weak, still recovering from her ordeal, but she had insisted. Her people were suffering, and she refused to hide while others fought for them. Danny had argued with her for an hour before finally giving in. He knew that look in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror when he decided to send those messages. The station appeared on their sensors at dawn on the 9th day. It was an ugly structure, a collection of metal modules and docking arms hanging in orbit around a dead moon. Patrol ships circled it like sharks around a wounded creature. Scanner readings showed dozens of life signs inside the station, most of them. Danny opened a channel to the fleet. "Everyone ready?" The responses came back one by one. "Ready, ready, ready." He took a deep breath. "Then let us do this." The attack began without warning. The fleet dropped out of the shadow of the moon and accelerated toward the station at full speed. The patrols scrambled to respond, but they were too slow. They had never faced an enemy like this, an unknown species with no apparent stake in the conflict. They did not know what to make of the mismatched ships hurtling toward them. Victor's voice crackled over the comm. "First wave, draw the patrols away from the station. Second wave, punch a hole in the perimeter. Third wave, hit the docking bays and get those prisoners out." The fleet split into 3 groups and executed the plan with surprising precision. The first wave engaged the patrol ships in a chaotic dogfight, weaving between laser blasts and missile trails. The second wave targeted the station's defense turrets, disabling them with concentrated fire. The third wave, led by Danny, raced toward the docking bays. Danny's hands were steady on the controls even though his heart was pounding. He had never been in combat before. He had trained for emergencies and practiced evasive maneuvers, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of flying through a storm of weapons fire. He focused on the task ahead and pushed everything else from his mind. The cargo hauler slammed into the docking bay with a violent shudder. The impact alarm screamed, but the hull held. Danny grabbed his weapon and ran for the hatch, followed close behind, her face pale but determined. They emerged into chaos. The docking bay was filled with smoke and screaming. Soldiers were scrambling to organize a defense, but the attack had caught them completely off guard. Danny fired his weapon and kept moving, pushing deeper into the station. The holding cells were in the lower levels, guided them through the corridors, following the pull of her telepathic senses. They encountered resistance at every turn, but the volunteers fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. These were not soldiers. They were miners and traders, mechanics and wanderers, but in that moment they fought like warriors. Danny reached the first holding cell and blasted the lock open. Inside, a dozen huddled together in fear. They stared at him with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening. "Come with me," Danny said. "We are getting you out of here." Stepped forward and spoke to them in their own language. Her voice was calm and reassuring, and the fear in their eyes began to fade. They rose and followed her, trusting her completely. More cells were opened. More prisoners were freed. The volunteers moved through the station like a flood, breaking chains and cutting locks, pulling them from their captivity and guiding them toward the ships. They tried to stop them, but they were overwhelmed. They had never imagined that anyone would come for these slaves. They had never believed that strangers would risk their lives for beings they had never met. The evacuation took less than an hour. 73 were rescued from the station, including healers, elders, and children who had been torn from their families. They were loaded onto the human ships and secured for the journey home. As the fleet prepared to withdraw, Danny returned to the main control room. He found the communication terminal and activated a broadcast on all frequencies. His face appeared on screens across the sector, a human face that most had never seen before. "My name is Danny Cole," he said. "I am a human from a world called Earth. The people you have been enslaving are now under our protection. What you have done to them is over. If you touch them again, if you harm another innocent being, we will come back. And next time we will not be so gentle." He ended the transmission and walked back to his ship. The journey home was quiet. The rescued sat in silence, unable to process their freedom. Some of them wept. Others simply stared at the walls as if waiting to wake from a dream. Moved among them, speaking softly, healing their wounds, helping them remember how to hope. Danny watched her from across the cargo bay. She had changed since he found her buried in the sand. The fear and despair that had haunted her eyes were gone, replaced by something stronger. She was not the same broken creature he had carried from the dunes. She was a healer again, a leader, a survivor. She looked up and caught his gaze. A smile crossed her face, small but genuine. Later, when the fleet had returned to safe space and had been transferred to a colonial medical facility, found Danny standing alone on the observation deck of Lucy's ship. He was staring out at the stars, his expression unreadable. She stood beside him in silence for a long moment. Then she placed her hand over his heart, just as she had done on the day she first woke. "I was buried in the sands," she said softly. "I was lifeless. I had accepted my fate. I thought the universe had forgotten me." Danny looked at her. "And then a human saved me," she continued. "Not because he had to, not because he would gain anything, but because he chose to, because he believed it was right." Danny nodded slowly. "That is who we are, we choose." Smiled, and warmth spread through her chest that she had never felt before. The universe was still vast and dangerous. They were still out there, and the fight was far from over. But for the first time since her world had fallen, she believed in tomorrow. Because she had seen what humans could do when they decided something mattered. And she knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up for strangers, willing to fight for justice even when the odds were impossible, the darkness would never win. The stars burned bright against the void. And somewhere out there, hope was spreading.